My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I serve as the president of Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa, a country with strong people and a long memory of struggle. I was not born into privilege. I grew up like many African children, surrounded by stories of hardship, but also stories of faith. In my home, the name of Jesus Christ was spoken with reverence. We believe that even in the hardest moments, God still watched over nations and leaders. Over the years, I have learned something important about leadership. Leadership is not only about strategy, it is also about conscience. Sometimes a leader must read documents, sometimes he must read history, and sometimes he must listen carefully to the quiet voice of God. What I am about to share happened during a moment that many people believed would shape the future of Africa. On the second day of March in the year 2026, I traveled to the city of Kigali in Rwanda. Kigali is the capital of Rwanda, and today it is known as one of the most organized and modern cities on the African continent. Rwanda was led by President Paul Kagame, a man who had overseen dramatic reforms in his country. Over the past decades, Rwanda had become known as a place of stability, discipline, and economic transformation. Because of that reputation, the African Union had begun calling Kigali something new. They called it the Conference Capital of Africa. This was where our meeting would take place. The gathering was scheduled to last 6 days, from the 2nd of March until the 7th of March in the year 2026. The topic of the summit seemed simple at first: financial cooperation and health partnerships between Africa and Western institutions. But beneath the surface, everyone in that room knew something deeper was being negotiated: the future of Africa's independence. Representatives from across the continent arrived in Kigali. President Paul Kagame hosted the summit. President William Ruto came from Kenya. President Nana Akufo-Addo represented Ghana. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi arrived from Egypt. And I came representing Burkina Faso. Across the table sat powerful international institutions, delegations from the International Monetary Fund, officials from the World Bank, government representatives from the United States, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. The proposals they brought were enormous. A financial support package valued at $48 billion for African nations. An international health program that promised 120 million doses of new vaccines to fight dengue fever and malaria, and an additional $30 billion in proposed investment into Africa's healthcare infrastructure, hospitals, medical laboratories, regional disease surveillance systems. On the surface, the offers seemed generous. Many leaders around the world would have signed such agreements without hesitation. But long before that meeting began, Africa had learned a difficult lesson. Sometimes help arrives with conditions. Sometimes agreements contain clauses that take years to fully understand, and sometimes the real price of a deal is not paid today. It is paid by the next generation. For 3 days we sat inside conference rooms at the Kigali Convention Center. We reviewed financial frameworks, we examined loan structures, we discussed vaccine deployment programs, we debated long-term infrastructure partnerships. The conversations were polite, professional, and carefully structured, but they were also intense. Every document contained numbers that could change the future of millions of African families. By the third evening, my mind was heavy with details. Contracts, health policy projections, debt structures. That night, I returned to my private presidential suite inside the Kigali Convention Center. I was exhausted. I remember sitting near the window and looking out across the quiet lights of Kigali. It was a beautiful city, peaceful, ordered, calm. But in my heart, something felt unsettled. After hours of meetings, I finally lay down to rest. I did not expect anything unusual that night. I simply closed my eyes, and I fell asleep. What happened next is something I have never forgotten. Something that, even today, I continue to reflect upon with humility. Because on that night, I had a dream. And in that dream, I believe Jesus Christ showed me something about Africa's past, its present, and its future. On the 4th day of March in the year 2026, the third night of our summit in Kigali, something happened that I cannot explain by ordinary reasoning. That evening had been long and exhausting. The discussions inside the conference rooms had grown more intense with every hour. Delegations from international institutions presented complex financial structures. Technical advisors showed projections about public health programs. Economists spoke about debt sustainability, market access, and development partnerships. Every document contained hundreds of pages. Every page contained numbers that represented hospitals, numbers that represented vaccines, numbers that represented loans. But numbers also represent consequences. By the time the final meeting of the evening ended, it was already late. My mind felt heavy with information. I remember shaking hands with several leaders before leaving the conference hall. President Paul Kagame spoke briefly with me near the exit. His tone was calm, as always, but thoughtful. "Tomorrow will be an important day," he said. I nodded. "Very important." We all knew that several agreements were expected to move closer to final approval within the next 48 hours. After leaving the hall, I walked slowly through the corridors of the Kigali Convention Center. The building itself is impressive. Its architecture reflects modern Africa, glass, light, and openness. Outside the windows, the city lights of Kigali spread across the hills like quiet stars. For a moment I paused and looked out across the skyline. I remember thinking about Burkina Faso, about our farmers, about our young soldiers, about the millions of families across Africa whose future could be shaped by decisions made inside that building. Leadership often feels lonely in moments like that. You sit at a table with presidents, ministers, bankers, and experts, yet in the end, every signature carries a silent responsibility. The responsibility toward people who are not in the room. When I finally returned to my presidential suite, it was already late into the night. The room was quiet. The lights of the city reflected softly against the large windows. On the desk beside the bed were several folders containing documents that my team had prepared earlier that evening. Loan structures, health program agreements, infrastructure investment proposals. I opened one of the folders and looked briefly through the pages. Some sections seemed encouraging. The proposed healthcare investments could potentially strengthen hospitals across multiple African countries, but other sections required deeper review. Certain clauses discussed procurement rights for international companies. Other sections referenced long-term partnerships connected to resource development. These were not small matters. Agreements like these can influence the economic direction of a country for decades. After a while, I closed the folder. My body was too tired to continue reading. I said a short prayer before going to sleep. It was not a long prayer, just a simple request for wisdom. Leadership requires courage, but it also requires guidance. That night, I simply asked God to help us make decisions that would protect the future of our people. Then I lay down and turned off the light. Within minutes, sleep came. But what followed did not feel like ordinary sleep. At first, everything was silent. Then slowly, the darkness around me began to change. I found myself standing somewhere that did not resemble the hotel room where I had fallen asleep. Instead, I stood in the middle of a vast African landscape. The land stretched far beyond what the eye could see. Tall grasses moved gently in the wind. The air was warm and calm. It looked like the wide plains of Africa, open, powerful, ancient. For a moment, I simply stood there, confused. I looked around, trying to understand where I was. There were no buildings, no roads, no signs of modern life. Only land, only sky. Then something began to change above me. The sky slowly brightened. At first it looked like the soft glow of early dawn, a faint light appearing on the horizon before sunrise. But this light grew stronger with every passing second. Soon the entire sky seemed to glow with a warm radiance that I cannot fully describe with ordinary words. It was not harsh like the sun. It was gentle, peaceful, yet powerful. I felt a deep sense of calm surrounding me, as if the entire landscape had become still in the presence of something sacred. Then I noticed something extraordinary behind me. Slowly, rising above the horizon, a massive image appeared. It was a map, a glowing map of the African continent. Every coastline was visible, from the deserts of the north to the forests of the Congo, from the eastern highlands to the Atlantic shores of the west. Africa, the entire continent, appeared behind me, illuminated with a soft golden light. I stood there silently, watching. Then the light grew even brighter, and in that moment, someone appeared within the light. A figure standing before me. At first, the brightness made it difficult to see clearly, but slowly the shape became visible. The figure wore a long white robe. The garment moved gently in the light, as if touched by a quiet wind. Around him was a glow that seemed alive, not blinding but full of warmth. His presence carried something deeper than authority. It carried compassion. His eyes were calm, yet filled with understanding. A look that seemed to see beyond time itself. In that moment, even within the dream, my heart felt a deep reverence, because I knew who stood before me. Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I did not hear thunder. I did not hear dramatic sounds. Only a calm voice, a voice that spoke clearly. Hear and understand. The words were simple, yet they carried weight. Behind him, the glowing map of Africa shone brightly against the horizon. Then he spoke again. Look. At that moment, the landscape around us began to change. The open field slowly faded, and images began to appear before my eyes. Scenes from different moments in history, moments that shaped the destiny of Africa. It felt as though time itself had opened, as if I was being shown something that every African leader must remember. Not only the present, but the past. The first image appeared like a window opening across the sky. A large conference room filled with men in dark suits. Maps spread across tables. Voices arguing over borders. The year was the late 19th century, and I began to understand what I was being shown. The beginning of something that changed Africa forever. As I stood there in the quiet light of that dream, the images before me grew clearer. It was as if the sky itself had become a living screen of history. The first scene that appeared showed a large hall filled with European officials. They sat around a long table covered with maps of Africa. Some leaned forward with measuring tools. Others pointed to lines drawn across the continent. Their voices were not loud, but their decisions were enormous. I recognized the moment almost immediately. It was the Berlin Conference of the late 19th century. The year was 1884. Inside that room, leaders from European empires gathered to divide the African continent among themselves. Germany hosted the conference. Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, and other powers participated. They spoke about territories. They spoke about trade. They spoke about influence. But the people of Africa were not present in that room. Not a single African voice was invited to the table. In the vision, I watched as rulers and diplomats drew lines across the map, straight lines cutting across rivers, forests, deserts, and mountains. Lines that ignored tribes. Lines that ignored languages. Lines that ignored ancient kingdoms that had existed for centuries. Those lines would later become the borders of modern African countries. But in that moment, they were drawn with cold precision, as if Africa were an empty land waiting to be organized. The voice of Jesus spoke quietly beside me. Watch carefully. The scene changed. Now I saw ships moving across dark oceans, large wooden vessels crossing the Atlantic. Below their decks, men and women were chained together in cramped spaces. I could hear the sounds of suffering, the sounds of fear. Millions of Africans were taken from their homeland during the centuries of the transatlantic slave trade. Historians estimate that more than 12 million African men, women, and children were transported across the ocean. Families were separated. Communities were destroyed. Entire regions lost generations of their strongest people. The images moved quickly. Ports in West Africa, slave markets in distant lands, chains, ships, human beings treated as cargo. I felt a deep heaviness in my heart as the scenes unfolded. The voice beside me remained calm but firm. This was one chapter. Then the vision shifted again. The map of Africa returned glowing behind us. But now different regions began to highlight themselves. Central Africa appeared first. Dense green forests stretched across the Congo basin. Then the scene moved closer. I saw labor camps. Men forced to harvest rubber from wild vines in the jungle. Armed guards standing nearby. Punishments carried out against villagers who could not meet production quotas. This was the Congo during the rule of King Leopold II of Belgium. Historians believe that during this brutal period, more than 10 million Congolese people lost their lives. Some died from forced labor. Others died from starvation, disease, or violence. Entire villages disappeared. The dream did not show these things in graphic detail, but the message was unmistakable. Africa's resources had been extracted for centuries. Gold, diamonds, rubber, copper. Each new discovery attracted foreign interests. Each resource created another cycle of control. The voice of Jesus spoke again. For generations, the wealth of this land flowed outward. The images continued. Railways built not to connect African communities, but to transport minerals from inland mines to coastal ports. Colonial administrations that controlled agriculture, trade, and taxation. Local leaders replaced by foreign governors. By the early 20th century, the vision showed nearly the entire African continent under European control. More than 90% of Africa had become colonies. Only a few regions remained politically independent. Yet even in those places, external economic influence was strong. The vision slowed. Then another change appeared. Crowds of Africans gathering in cities during the mid-20th century. Flags rising. Voices calling for independence. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. Across the continent, African nations began reclaiming their sovereignty. Between the late 1950s and the early 1960s, dozens of African countries gained independence from colonial rule. The joy in those scenes was powerful. People dancing, people celebrating, new national flags rising above government buildings. The dream allowed me to feel that hope, a belief that Africa would finally control its own destiny. But then the vision paused, and the voice beside me spoke again. Freedom on paper does not always mean freedom in practice. The images began to change once more. Now I saw newly independent African nations struggling with economic challenges. Many inherited borders that divided ethnic groups or forced rival communities into the same political system. Infrastructure built for colonial extraction, not for balanced development. Economies dependent on exporting raw materials. Foreign companies still controlling large mining operations. Loans beginning to appear. Development programs introduced by international institutions. In many cases, these programs were meant to support growth, but sometimes they also carried conditions. Conditions that shaped national policies. Conditions that influenced markets. Conditions that affected how countries managed their resources. As I watched these scenes unfold, the glowing map of Africa behind us slowly dimmed. Not into darkness, but into a quieter light. The voice of Jesus spoke again. The past is not shown to create anger. It is shown so that leaders remember. I stood silently in that field as the images faded. The message was clear. History carries lessons, and nations that forget those lessons risk repeating them. Then the vision shifted once more. The peaceful field returned, but only for a moment, because the next images that began to appear were not from the past. They were from the present. Modern conference rooms, financial institutions, digital screens, contracts, and a new kind of influence that no longer relied on chains. As the final images of Africa's colonial past slowly faded, the quiet field returned for a brief moment. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. The glowing map of Africa still hovered behind us, but now the light surrounding it had changed. It was no longer the warm gold of ancient history. Instead, it carried a cooler brightness, something that felt closer to the modern world. The voice of Jesus spoke again, calm and steady. The past used chains. A pause followed. The present often uses agreements. As those words settled into the air, the landscape around us began to transform again. The open African plain dissolved into something entirely different. Suddenly, I found myself standing inside a large modern conference room. Glass walls surrounded the space. Large digital screens displayed charts and financial projections. Long polished tables stretched across the room with neatly arranged microphones and stacks of documents. It looked very familiar. It looked very much like the meeting rooms we had been sitting in inside the Kigali Convention Center only hours earlier. Men and women in formal business attire sat around the table. Some represented international financial institutions. Others represented multinational companies. There were legal advisors, economic consultants, health policy specialists. The room was filled with quiet conversations and careful language. No one was shouting. No one appeared aggressive. Everything looked professional, orderly, structured. But the voice beside me spoke again. They no longer control through soldiers. They control through systems. One of the large digital screens illuminated. Charts appeared showing financial flows across continents. Africa was highlighted on the map. Numbers appeared beside it. Debt levels, loan obligations, repayment schedules. The number on the screen grew larger until it filled the entire display. More than $1.8 trillion. That was the estimated combined external debt of African countries in the modern era. Of course, not all debt is harmful. Loans can help build roads. They can support hospitals. They can expand education. But the vision began to reveal something deeper. Another chart appeared. This one showed government budgets across multiple African countries. Different colored lines represented how national income was allocated. Healthcare, education, infrastructure, agriculture, and then a large portion marked debt repayment. In several countries, the percentage approached 40% of national spending. 40% of a country's budget used simply to service existing loans. The voice of Jesus spoke again. When debt grows faster than development, freedom becomes fragile. The screen changed again. Now images of international meetings appeared. Negotiation tables, financial agreements, aid packages, large development programs designed to support African economies. On the surface, these programs looked beneficial. Many were introduced with the language of partnership, economic cooperation, development assistance, public health collaboration. But then the vision zoomed in closer. Contracts began to appear on the screen. Pages filled with legal language, clause, conditions, requirements. Some agreements required countries to open specific sectors of their economies to foreign companies. Others tied financial assistance to political reforms. Still others required long-term concessions involving natural resources. The voice beside me spoke again. Assistance can be helpful, but assistance can also carry influence. Then another image appeared. A large warehouse filled with medical supplies. Boxes stacked neatly in rows. Labels identifying pharmaceutical companies. The scene shifted to clinics in several African countries. Healthcare workers preparing vaccination programs. Doctors organizing public health campaigns. The vision then displayed the names of several countries where large-scale vaccine trials had taken place in recent years. Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa. Each country had participated in different global health initiatives. Most of these programs were designed to combat serious diseases, malaria, dengue fever, other infectious illnesses that affect millions of people. And the need for better healthcare solutions in Africa is very real. But the voice of Jesus spoke again. Medical progress is good, yet every nation must also protect its people. Another screen appeared. This time the image showed the development process for new vaccines, scientific trials, laboratory testing, clinical phases, approval procedures. Normally, such processes take many years before full deployment. The vision then revealed something concerning. One particular vaccine program appeared on the screen. It had not yet completed full testing in several Western countries. Yet proposals were being prepared for large-scale distribution across parts of Africa. More than 60 million people were expected to receive the treatment. The voice beside me did not accuse anyone. It did not condemn. It simply spoke with clarity. Every agreement must be examined. Every program must be verified. Leadership requires vigilance. The room around me shifted again. Now I saw images of major infrastructure projects, hospitals, research laboratories, transportation networks, large international investment proposals worth tens of billions of dollars. These projects had the potential to transform healthcare systems across the continent. But once again, the vision zoomed closer to the contracts behind those investments. Some agreements contained clauses granting resource extraction rights, long-term rights, 20 years, 30 years, minerals, rare earth elements. The vision made something clear. Modern influence rarely arrives through conquest. It arrives through documents, through economic leverage, through agreements that appear beneficial in the short term but may shape control over resources in the long term. The voice beside me spoke once more. They do not use chains. They use contracts. I stood silently in that dream, not feeling anger, not feeling fear, only a growing awareness of the responsibility carried by leaders. Because every agreement signed by a government can affect millions of lives, sometimes for generations. The glowing map of Africa behind us began to shine again. But now the light divided into two paths spreading outward across the continent. The voice spoke once more. The present always leads to a choice. And as those words settled into the air, the next vision began to unfold. A vision not of the past, not of the present, but of the future. Two very different futures, depending on the decisions that Africa's leaders would make. As the modern conference room slowly dissolved around me, the dream carried me back to the wide African plain where the vision had begun. The air was calm again. The tall grass moved softly in the wind, and the glowing map of Africa still stood behind the figure of Jesus, illuminating the horizon like a great living symbol of the continent. But something had changed. The light that surrounded the map now began to divide. At first it looked like a simple shift in brightness. Then, slowly, two different paths of light began spreading across the continent. One path moved westward and northward across the land. The other path moved eastward and southward. Both were bright, but the feeling they carried was very different. Jesus turned slightly toward me, and his voice was steady. Every generation of leaders must choose. The first path began to grow clearer. Images started appearing across that side of the continent. Large cities filled with imported goods. Ships arriving at ports carrying products manufactured far away. Factories across Africa sitting quiet while foreign industries produced finished goods. The continent had become a vast market, a place where millions of consumers bought products made elsewhere: phones, machines, medicine, vehicles, even simple household tools. Africa was buying almost everything, but producing very little. Another image appeared: government offices reviewing national budgets. A large portion of those budgets was allocated to debt repayment. The numbers on the screen grew steadily. Year after year, the debt burden expanded. By the year 2035, the projections showed that many African nations would be paying nearly double the amount they currently owed. Not because leaders were irresponsible, but because loan structures and interest payments continued to accumulate over time. Then the vision showed something else: mining operations across the continent. Large international companies extracting minerals from African soil: gold, cobalt, lithium, rare earth elements, all essential for the modern global economy. Yet most of these resources were being exported in raw form, unprocessed. The wealth left the continent before local industries could transform it into finished products. Factories that could have created jobs, technologies that could have strengthened African economies. The voice of Jesus spoke again: if leaders sign agreements without careful thought, the continent will remain a supplier of raw wealth and a buyer of finished goods. The images continued. Urban populations grew rapidly. Young Africans searched for employment. Many were educated. Many were talented. But industrial development remained limited. Some young people left their countries in search of opportunity elsewhere. Others stayed but struggled to find meaningful work. The vision slowed. Then the first path dimmed, not into darkness, but into uncertainty. Then the second path began to shine brighter. Immediately, the images on this side of the continent felt different. The first scene showed African leaders meeting together, not with foreign delegations, but with each other. Regional economic councils, continental financial forums, African institutions designed to coordinate development strategies across the continent. The African Union played a stronger role. Regional banks expanded their influence. A new financial framework appeared, an African financial system designed to support development projects without excessive dependence on external debt. The vision showed African development banks financing infrastructure, African pension funds investing in industrial growth, African technology hubs collaborating across borders. The voice of Jesus spoke gently: unity multiplies strength. The images continued. Factories appeared across several African countries. Some specialized in pharmaceutical production. Others manufactured agricultural equipment. Others processed minerals extracted from local mines. Instead of exporting raw materials alone, African nations began producing finished products. Medicines manufactured within Africa. Medical equipment designed by African engineers. Regional supply chains connecting different countries across the continent. Young scientists working inside modern research laboratories. Pharmaceutical companies based in Africa developing treatments for diseases that disproportionately affect African populations. The vision then showed universities expanding their research programs, engineering institutes, medical schools, technology incubators. Students from across Africa studying science, medicine, and advanced manufacturing. Many of them returned to their home countries after graduation. Instead of leaving permanently, they contributed to building local industries. The map of Africa behind us glowed brighter. New infrastructure networks appeared across the continent. Railways connecting inland regions to major ports. Energy grids linking countries together. Digital networks expanding communication and innovation. Trade between African countries increased dramatically. Instead of exporting most resources outside the continent, African nations began trading more with each other. The voice of Jesus spoke again. Africa has never lacked resources. It has often lacked coordinated leadership. The final scene in the vision of the second path showed the year 2050. Africa had become one of the most dynamic economic regions in the world, not because of foreign control, but because African leaders had chosen cooperation, investment in education, and responsible management of their natural wealth. Cities across the continent had grown into centers of innovation. African pharmaceutical companies supplied medicines not only to Africa, but to other regions of the world. African technology firms competed in global markets. African agricultural production helped feed growing populations. The voice beside me spoke one final time about the future. The difference between these two paths is not destiny. It is decision. The glowing map slowly merged the two paths back into one. And in that moment I understood something clearly. Africa's future would not be decided only by foreign institutions. It would also be decided by African leaders, by the agreements we sign, by the industries we build, by the unity we choose to pursue or fail to pursue. The wind moved again through the grass of the field. The vision paused, and Jesus turned toward me once more. There is more you must understand, because what came next in the dream was not about history or economics or geopolitics. It was about leadership itself, and the 4 warnings that every leader should remember before placing their signature on any agreement that affects millions of lives. As the vision of Africa's future slowly faded, the wide plain returned once again. The sky was calm. The tall grass moved softly in the wind. The glowing map of Africa still stood behind us, steady and bright, as if reminding me that everything I had just seen was connected to the destiny of that land. For a moment there was silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of reflection. Then Jesus spoke again. This time, his words were directed not only to me, but to every leader who carries responsibility over people. Leadership is not measured by power, he said quietly. It is measured by the weight of the decisions you make. As he spoke, the air around us seemed to shift once more. The dream did not show historical scenes now. It showed something simpler. Moments that every leader eventually faces. Documents waiting for signatures. Meetings where decisions must be made. Agreements that promise opportunity but also carry risk. And then Jesus began to give what I can only describe as 4 warnings. Not accusations. Not commands spoken with anger, but guidance spoken with clarity. The first warning came slowly. A leader must be careful with what he signs. As he spoke those words, the vision showed a simple image. A single pen resting beside a document. Just a signature line. Nothing dramatic. Yet the weight of that image felt enormous. Because one signature can activate agreements worth billions of dollars. One signature can determine who controls natural resources. One signature can shape economic policy for decades. Jesus continued, a signature placed without wisdom can affect millions of people who will never meet the person who signed it. In that moment, I thought about the many agreements that governments sign every year. Trade agreements, financial loans, military partnerships, health programs. Most citizens never see those documents, yet they live with the consequences of those agreements every day. The second warning followed soon after. Leaders must remember who they serve. The dream showed another image. A group of ordinary people, farmers working in fields, teachers inside small classrooms, nurses caring for patients inside clinics. These were not politicians. They were ordinary citizens, families, communities, people who wake early each morning simply trying to build a stable life. Jesus spoke again. A nation does not exist for banks. It does not exist for corporations. It does not exist for international approval. He paused briefly. A nation exists for its people. The meaning of those words felt very clear. When leaders sit inside negotiation rooms, they often face many pressures. Pressure from financial institutions, pressure from powerful governments, pressure from investors, pressure from political alliances. But beneath all those pressures, the most important responsibility remains unchanged. Protect the people. The third warning came next. Remember history. The vision returned briefly to the earlier images of Africa's past. Colonial maps, extracted resources, foreign control. But the images did not linger long. Instead, Jesus spoke calmly. History is not meant to trap nations in resentment. It is meant to give them wisdom. If leaders forget the lessons of history, they risk repeating the same patterns under different names. New contracts, new systems, new language, but sometimes the same outcomes. Then the fourth warning came, and this one was different. It was not about politics. It was not about economics. It was about something deeper. Jesus looked toward the glowing map of Africa and said softly, "The true strength of leadership is not authority, it is faith." For a moment I did not fully understand what he meant. Then the dream revealed another image. African leaders standing in quiet moments of reflection. Some praying, some seeking wisdom before making decisions. The voice continued, "Power can guide a nation for a short time, but faith guides a leader's conscience." When leaders believe that their actions will ultimately be judged not only by history, but by God, they tend to act with greater humility, greater caution, greater responsibility. The wind moved gently across the field again. The four warnings had been spoken, and with them came a deeper understanding. Leadership is not simply about solving immediate problems. It is about protecting future generations, about making decisions today that will still make sense 20 or 30 years from now. Jesus looked at me once more. His voice was calm. You were shown these things for a reason. The glowing map behind him began to fade slowly. The light around the field softened, and then the final words of the dream came. Share what you have seen. As those words echoed in the quiet air, the entire vision began to dissolve. The field faded. The sky dimmed. The light disappeared. And suddenly, I woke up. When my eyes opened, the room was completely dark. For a moment, I did not move. My heart was beating faster than usual, as if my body was still inside the dream. The quiet hum of the hotel's air system was the only sound in the room. I turned my head slowly toward the digital clock beside the bed. It showed 3:40 in the morning, the 4th day of March, 2026. The dream had felt so real that it took several seconds for my mind to fully return to the present moment. I sat upright and placed my feet on the floor. The city of Kigali was still asleep outside the window. From the upper floor of the Kigali Convention Center Hotel, the lights of the city stretched across the hills in small clusters of yellow and white. The streets were quiet. No traffic. No noise. Yet inside my mind, the images from the dream were still vivid. The glowing map of Africa. The scenes from history. The modern financial systems. The 2 possible futures. And the 4 warnings about leadership. I remained seated there for several minutes thinking, dreams are strange things. Many of them fade quickly once we wake, but this one did not fade. Every detail remained clear. I felt something deep in my spirit. Not fear, not excitement, responsibility. I stood up and walked slowly toward the window. From that height, Kigali looked peaceful. Rwanda had become one of the most orderly countries in Africa. Its capital city had gained international recognition for stability and development. That was precisely why this summit had been organized there. But the vision I had seen reminded me of something important. Progress requires vigilance. Development requires wisdom. And agreements signed too quickly can create problems that last for generations. As I stood by the window, I thought about the documents we had been reviewing during the previous days. The financial support package valued at $48 billion. The international health programs promising 120 million vaccine doses. The proposed $30 billion in healthcare infrastructure investment. On paper, these proposals appeared beneficial. Many African nations urgently needed stronger health systems, hospitals, research laboratories, medical training programs, and financial support could help accelerate those improvements. Yet the dream had shown something that made me uneasy. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense that people sometimes imagine, but something more subtle. The possibility that agreements signed without careful examination could slowly transfer influence away from African nations. I returned to the desk and opened one of the folders that my staff had prepared earlier that evening. Inside were summaries of the proposed financial arrangements connected to the summit discussions, loan structures, repayment terms, procurement guidelines. As I read through several sections, one detail caught my attention again. Certain infrastructure projects required that the majority of construction contracts be awarded to companies from outside Africa. That meant that although the funding would enter Africa, a large portion of it could flow back out through those contracts. I closed the folder again. Then I sat quietly for another moment. The dream had ended with a clear instruction. Share what you have seen. But how does a leader share something like that? I could not simply walk into the conference hall and tell the entire assembly that I had seen a vision during the night. Leadership requires credibility, careful communication. But the concerns raised in the dream were serious enough that they needed discussion. I reached for the telephone beside the desk. There are moments when leaders must speak immediately. This felt like one of those moments. The first call I placed was to the office of President Paul Kagame. Even though it was early, presidential security teams are always awake. Within a few minutes, I was connected to one of his senior staff members. I explained that I needed to speak with the president as soon as possible. Not later in the morning. Soon. The message was delivered. Then I placed 2 additional calls. One to President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana, another to President William Ruto of Kenya. All 3 leaders had been present during the previous day's negotiations. All 3 had expressed careful interest in reviewing the financial proposals in greater detail before moving forward. Within a short time, I received confirmation. A private meeting could be arranged. 5:30 in the morning. It would take place inside one of the smaller conference rooms at the Kigali Convention Center before the official summit schedule resumed. After making those calls, I prepared myself quickly. The sky outside the window was beginning to lighten slightly. The first signs of dawn were appearing above the hills surrounding Kigali. When I stepped into the corridor, security personnel were already moving quietly through the building. Presidential schedules begin early, but this meeting would be different. It would not appear on the public agenda. It would not include international delegations, only African leaders. As I walked toward the elevator, the images from the dream returned once more. The two paths for Africa's future, the warnings about leadership, the reminder that one signature can influence millions of lives. By the time I reached the conference level of the building, several members of my team were already waiting. They had also been called earlier. I told them we would need access to several of the summit documents again, not later in the day. Immediately, at 5:30 in the morning, 4 African presidents sat together in a quiet room inside the Kigali Convention Center. President Paul Kagame, President Nana Akufo-Addo, President William Ruto, and myself. No cameras, no press, just leaders speaking openly. At first, the room was silent. Then President Kagame looked at me and asked calmly, "You said the matter was urgent." I nodded, "Yes." And then I told them about the dream. But more importantly, I told them about the concerns it raised. Concerns about the financial structures, concerns about the healthcare agreements, concerns about the long-term resource provisions hidden inside some of the contracts. The room remained quiet as I spoke, not because they doubted me, but because the questions raised were serious, and those questions deserved answers. When I finished speaking, President Akufo-Addo leaned back in his chair and said something that stayed with me. "Dream or not, we should verify the documents." President Ruto nodded. President Kagame simply said, "Then we review everything." And that is exactly what we did. What we discovered during the next several hours confirmed that caution had been necessary. When the 4 of us finished our brief exchange that morning, the room grew quiet again. Outside the windows of the Kigali Convention Center, the sky had begun to brighten. Dawn was spreading slowly across the hills of Rwanda. The city was waking up. But inside that conference room, the atmosphere had become serious. Not tense, not hostile, but focused. President Kagame stood and walked toward the table where several document folders had been placed by the staff earlier. "These agreements are complicated," he said calmly, "but nothing prevents us from reviewing them more carefully." That was the beginning. Within minutes, our advisors and technical teams were called in. Not the large delegations that usually attend international negotiations. Only a small group of economists, legal experts, and policy advisors from our respective countries. The instruction was simple. Review the agreements again. Every clause, every condition, every annex and supporting document, not later in the week. The first document we examined concerned the financial assistance package that had been presented during the summit. $48 billion. It was described as a combined support initiative involving international financial institutions and development partners. The funds were intended to help African countries strengthen infrastructure, healthcare systems, and economic development programs. On the surface, the proposal seemed extremely beneficial. Africa's infrastructure needs are enormous. Roads, hospitals, energy systems, water networks. Any financial support that could accelerate these improvements would naturally attract attention. But as our advisors began studying the deeper sections of the document, several details emerged that required discussion. One of the clauses specified procurement requirements. In simple terms, procurement determines which companies are allowed to bid for major development projects funded by international loans. Under this agreement, a significant percentage of project contracts would need to be awarded to companies based in the lending countries. This meant that although the funding would be directed toward African infrastructure, much of the economic benefit would flow back to foreign contractors, construction companies, engineering firms, medical equipment suppliers. Another clause addressed project management oversight. In many cases, international consultants would supervise implementation. Again, this was not necessarily wrong. External expertise can be valuable, but it also meant that local African institutions would have limited authority over some of the largest projects funded through the agreement. President Ruto listened carefully as the advisors explained these details. Then he asked a simple question. How much of the $48 billion would actually remain in African economies? The economists began calculating estimates. The answer varied depending on the specific project, but the pattern was clear. A large portion of the funding could circulate back to the same economies that were providing the loans. The money would enter Africa, but not all of it would stay there. President Akufo-Addo leaned forward slightly. This requires careful evaluation, he said quietly. None of us were accusing anyone of wrongdoing. International development finance has always involved complex arrangements, but complexity also requires vigilance. The second document we examined related to the healthcare initiative. This program had received considerable attention during the summit discussions. 120 million vaccine doses were scheduled for distribution across several African countries to combat dengue fever and malaria. These diseases continue to affect millions of people across tropical regions. The development of effective vaccines could save many lives. No responsible leader would dismiss such an opportunity without serious consideration. But once again, the details required closer inspection. One section of the health program referenced a new vaccine that was still undergoing regulatory evaluation in several Western countries. Yet the proposed distribution plan included large-scale deployment across parts of Africa. More than 60 million people could receive the vaccine during the initial phase. Our medical advisors raised an important point. Clinical trials for vaccines typically follow a sequence of stages: laboratory testing, controlled human trials, large population studies, full regulatory approval. In this case, the program documentation indicated that some phases of testing were still underway. That did not automatically mean the vaccine was unsafe, but it meant that additional independent verification would be necessary before launching mass vaccination programs. President Kagame spoke carefully. Africa should benefit from medical innovation, he said, but we must also maintain scientific independence. The room agreed. Health programs should always be guided by transparent data and careful evaluation. The third area we reviewed involved investment projects connected to healthcare infrastructure. These projects were part of the $30 billion development initiative that had been discussed earlier in the summit. The proposals included construction of regional hospitals, pharmaceutical storage facilities, and biomedical research centers across multiple African countries. All of these goals were positive. Africa urgently needs stronger health systems. But within the annex sections of several contracts, our legal advisors discovered additional provisions. These provisions related to natural resource access. Some agreements included long-term rights for international companies to participate in mineral extraction projects connected to financing arrangements. In certain cases, those rights extended for 20 to 30 years. The resources involved were strategic minerals used in modern technologies: lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements. These materials are essential for batteries, electronics, and renewable energy systems. Africa possesses large reserves of many of these minerals. Control over such resources can shape economic power for decades. None of these clauses were hidden in the sense of being secret. They were written clearly within the legal documents, but they required careful reading and careful discussion. By the time the sun had fully risen over Kigali, our small group had spent several hours reviewing the material. No accusations were made. No dramatic conclusions were announced. But one thing became clear. The agreements required deeper examination before any final signatures could be placed. President Kagame looked around the table. "We are not rejecting cooperation," he said. "We are simply requesting time." President Ruto nodded. President Akufo-Addo agreed, and I spoke as well. "Africa must move forward with partnerships," I said. "But partnerships should always be based on transparency and mutual respect." The decision that followed was unanimous. We would recommend a temporary pause on signing the proposed agreements. Not a rejection, a review, an independent evaluation involving experts from multiple African nations. A process that would ensure that every clause, every condition, and every long-term implication was fully understood before any commitments were finalized, because when leaders sign documents affecting millions of people, they must be certain that the future being built is truly in the interest of their citizens. That morning in Kigali marked the beginning of a deeper conversation among African leaders. A conversation about financial independence, healthcare sovereignty, and the responsibility of leadership in a rapidly changing world. But the story did not end in that meeting room, because before the summit concluded, a message had to be delivered, not in anger, not in confrontation, but with clarity, a message to the world about the direction Africa intended to take. By the time the official sessions of the summit resumed later that morning, the atmosphere inside the Kigali Convention Center felt different. Nothing dramatic had happened on the surface. Delegations still moved through the halls, advisors still carried folders filled with reports and proposals. Interpreters still prepared translation equipment for the next round of meetings. But among the African leaders who had met privately that morning, there was now a deeper awareness. We had seen the details, we had reviewed the clauses, and we had agreed on something important. Africa should never reject cooperation, but Africa must always understand the full meaning of every agreement. The summit schedule continued throughout the day. Representatives from the International Monetary Fund presented economic projections for the coming decade. Officials from the World Bank discussed development strategies designed to improve healthcare access across several regions of the continent. Delegations from the United States, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom spoke about partnership, global health cooperation, and shared development goals. All of these discussions were conducted respectfully. No one raised their voice. No one accused anyone of wrongdoing. But when the moment arrived to discuss the timeline for signing the proposed agreements, the African delegation spoke with a unified voice. President Paul Kagame addressed the room first, since Rwanda was the host of the summit. He thanked the international delegations for their engagement and for the resources they had proposed. Then he spoke calmly about the importance of responsible leadership. He explained that the agreements presented during the summit contained significant opportunities, but they also contained long-term implications that required additional review. Then President Nana Akufo-Addo spoke. He emphasized that Africa valued cooperation with international partners. However, cooperation must always be based on transparency and mutual respect. No continent should rush into agreements that could influence its economic future for decades. President William Ruto followed. He reminded the room that Africa was not rejecting the proposals. Instead, African leaders were requesting something very reasonable. Time. Time for independent evaluation. Time for technical experts from across Africa to review the financial structures, healthcare programs, and investment provisions. Finally, it was my turn to speak. I stood and looked across the room. Representatives from major international institutions were seated at the long conference tables. Diplomats from several Western governments were present. Economic advisors and policy experts filled the surrounding seats. Everyone was waiting to hear how Africa would respond. I spoke calmly. Africa does not oppose partnership, I began. Our continent has benefited from cooperation in many areas, including healthcare, education, and infrastructure. I paused briefly before continuing. But partnership must never require us to abandon responsibility toward our people. The room remained silent. I continued speaking. The agreements presented during this summit involve financial commitments valued in the tens of billions of dollars. They involve healthcare programs that will affect millions of lives. They involve long-term investment projects connected to strategic resources. Then I said something that reflected the discussion we had held earlier that morning. As leaders, we cannot sign documents of this magnitude without careful examination. I explained that a decision had been reached among several African nations participating in the summit. A joint review committee would be created. The committee would include 30 experts representing 12 African countries. These experts would study the financial frameworks. They would review the scientific data related to the healthcare initiatives. They would examine the legal terms connected to infrastructure and resource investment. Their task would be simple. Ensure that every agreement aligns with the long-term interests of African citizens. The review would not take forever, but it would be thorough. Only after that process was completed would African leaders consider final signatures. The room remained quiet for a moment. Then something interesting happened. Several representatives from international institutions nodded. They understood the logic. Responsible leadership requires careful decision-making, and transparency benefits everyone involved. The summit continued for several more days. Technical discussions continued. Economic advisors exchanged ideas. Healthcare specialists shared research. But the most important outcome of the summit was not a signed document. It was a message. On the final day of the meeting, I was asked to deliver a closing statement on behalf of the participating African leaders. The hall was full. Delegations from across the world were present. Journalists and observers were watching carefully. I spoke slowly. Africa is not rejecting cooperation with the world, I said. Our continent welcomes partnership with every nation that approaches us with respect. Then I continued. But Africa will no longer sign agreements that place the burden of future generations at risk. The message was not confrontational. It was simply clear. Africa intends to cooperate. Africa intends to develop. Africa intends to build stronger healthcare systems, stronger economies, and stronger partnerships with the global community. But Africa also intends to protect its sovereignty, its resources, its people. When the summit ended that evening, many participants returned to their countries with new perspectives. Some agreements would eventually move forward after further negotiation. Others would require adjustment. But the most important result of the summit was a renewed commitment among African leaders, a commitment to examine every opportunity carefully, to learn from history, and to ensure that development agreements truly benefit the people they are meant to serve. Later that evening, after the final meetings had ended, I stood once more near the window of my hotel room overlooking Kigali. The city lights shimmered quietly across the hills. I thought again about the dream from earlier that week, the images of Africa's past, the warnings about the present, the two possible futures. Whether one believes such dreams come from the mind or from something deeper, the message was simple. Leadership carries responsibility, and the future of Africa will depend not only on the actions of the outside world, but on the decisions made by African leaders themselves. As I share this story with you today, I do not claim to possess perfect wisdom. No leader does. Every nation faces challenges. Every government must balance opportunity and risk. But there is one truth that history has taught us again and again. Africa is not a poor continent. Africa is a continent rich with resources, culture, intelligence, and human potential. What Africa has often lacked is not wealth. It has sometimes lacked leadership that is willing to defend the long-term future of its people. That is changing. Across Africa today, a new generation is rising. Young engineers, scientists, teachers, entrepreneurs, doctors, farmers. These men and women represent the real future of the continent. They deserve leaders who think carefully before making decisions that affect their lives. They deserve leaders who remember history. Leaders who listen not only to economists and advisors, but also to conscience. And for those of us who believe in God, conscience is not only a political concept, it is spiritual. Faith reminds us that power is temporary, titles are temporary, but the impact of our actions can last far beyond our own lifetime. The world today faces many divisions, political disagreements, economic competition, distrust between nations. Yet I still believe that cooperation is possible. Real cooperation, the kind based on honesty and fairness, the kind that respects the dignity of every nation, large or small. Africa does not wish harm on any country. Africa seeks partnership with every country that approaches us in good faith. But partnership must never require silence about important questions. Responsible leadership requires courage. The courage to pause, the courage to examine, the courage to say, let us understand this fully before we move forward. I also believe that every person, whether a leader or an ordinary citizen, has a role to play in shaping the future. We all make choices. Choices about how we treat others, choices about honesty, choices about whether we pursue justice or ignore it. For those who follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, the message is clear. Love your neighbor, act with integrity, seek truth, protect the vulnerable. When leaders follow these principles, nations become stronger. When citizens follow these principles, societies become healthier. My hope is that the world will move toward greater understanding, toward cooperation that uplifts people rather than exploiting them, toward development that benefits future generations rather than burdening them, and above all, toward a renewed commitment to moral leadership. If you are listening to this story, perhaps you are someone who cares about the future of nations. Perhaps you are someone who believes that faith and leadership should not be separated. If so, I invite you to continue reflecting on these ideas. Share your thoughts, discuss them with others, and continue seeking truth wherever it may lead. Because the future of the world does not depend only on presidents or governments. It depends on millions of individuals who choose honesty, wisdom, and compassion every day. And so I close with these words, spoken not with pride, but with sincerity. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. What I have shared with you comes from my heart and from my experience. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. I speak these words because I believe they matter. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. And what I have told you, I believe to be true. If this message has given you something to think about, I encourage you to continue the conversation. Reflect on it. Share your perspective. And if you wish to hear more stories about leadership, faith, and the future of nations, you are welcome to stay connected and follow these discussions as they continue. Because sometimes the most important conversations begin with a single story, and perhaps this is one of them.